The sun over the Yucatan was no ordinary sun. It was a blade, molten and merciless, slicing through the thick air heavy with incense and the faint sweetness of decay. Beneath its glare, a man knelt on the white stones of the plaza, his body trembling not from weakness but from the unbearable weight of 1,000 eyes. Around him, the crowd pressed close. Farmers, nobles, priests' faces painted in sacred reds and blacks, their breaths mingling in a feverish chorus that smelled of maize and sweat and fear. Above them loomed the stepped pyramid of the temple, carved with serpents and jaguars, the stones still darkened by stains too old to remember, too fresh to forget. Somewhere high above, a conch horn wailed, its note long and hollow like the echo of a god's hunger. They said the Maya were a people of science and stars, builders of calendars that touched the heavens, dreamers who mapped eternity in the patterns of the sky. But the truth, whispered beneath the hum of civilization, was far more unsettling. This was not a world that feared death. It was a world that worshipped it, that wove it into its laws, its rituals, its very sense of justice. To live among the Maya was to live in the shadow of gods who demanded balance through blood and terror, where every wrongdoing, every betrayal, every whisper of defiance had a price measured not in coin or exile, but in agony. Theirs was a system where punishment was not meant to correct, but to remind, not to end a life, but to destroy it piece by piece, until even the soul forgot what mercy felt like. Imagine standing in that plaza as the drums begin, feeling the vibration crawl up through the soles of your feet, watching as the priests move in slow, deliberate rhythm, their hands stained with ritual ash and something darker. Imagine knowing that in this world innocence meant nothing, for even the gods could be offended by accident, and their justice was swift, sacred, and absolute. Before we descend deeper into this shadow of history, take a moment to breathe, and if you have the courage to keep going, hit subscribe, because what lies ahead are the secrets that history tried to bury. These are not tales of death. They are tales of what happens when death is not enough. Let us step into the forgotten courts of the Maya, where justice bled, and punishment was worse than death. To understand the cruelty of Mayan punishment, one must first understand the beauty that hid it. The Maya built their world from jungle and limestone, carving civilization out of chaos with an artistry that defied time itself. Their cities rose like living mountains, pyramids piercing the clouds, palaces painted in vermilion and turquoise, observatories aligned with the breath of the stars. In their sacred texts and carved codices, they wrote of gods who shaped men from maize dough and blood, for they believed that life itself was a delicate mixture of nourishment and sacrifice. Every beat of the human heart was a tribute to the divine order, and every drop of blood that spilled, whether in love or in torment, was part of the endless rhythm that kept the cosmos alive. They were not savages, they were scientists of the spiritual, poets of pain, architects of time. And yet, within their brilliance was a darkness so profound that even their gods seemed to hunger for it. To live in the Mayan world was to live beneath the gaze of deities who watched everything. The Sun Lord who demanded light in exchange for blood, the skeletal gods of the underworld who waited patiently for every breath to falter. Society was divided not only by class, but by proximity to divinity. Kings and nobles, descended from the gods themselves, were both rulers and sacrifices, in waiting. Commoners toiled in fields and temples, artisans painted walls with the stories of conquest, while priests, cloaked in jaguar pelts and the scent of burning copal, interpreted the will of the heavens. Justice, in this world, was not an earthly matter. It was divine arithmetic. Every wrongdoing disturbed the fragile harmony of the cosmos, and punishment was the price of restoration. There were no prisons, no long trials, no appeals. There was only the law, carved in stone and memory, as ancient as creation itself. The Mayan legal system, though seemingly orderly, was founded upon the principle that pain was cleansing. Crimes were categorized according to their impact on the cosmic balance. Adultery, theft, betrayal, heresy, and murder, each carried a different weight in the eyes of both gods and men. The local leaders, called batabs, presided over justice with the guidance of priests, whose authority came not from human decree, but from divine interpretation. When a man was accused, his fate depended less on evidence than on spiritual signs, omens, dreams, or the reading of sacred calendars. If a comet had burned across the sky, or if the maize harvest had failed, it could be taken as proof that the accused had offended the gods. Guilt, therefore, was often predetermined by circumstance, and punishment became an offering rather than a correction. Yet, the genius of the Mayan system was its precision. Punishment was not chaos, it was ritual. To be judged was to enter a sacred script, one whose ending was written long before birth. For minor offenses, the punishments were designed to humiliate and correct. For greater sins, they were designed to terrify and destroy. The Maya believed that suffering purified not just the sinner, but the entire community. When one bled, balance was restored. When one screamed, the gods listened. And when one died in agony, the world became clean again. In this logic, justice and horror became indistinguishable, each feeding the other in an endless loop of fear and faith. To outsiders, this might seem monstrous, but to the Maya, it was divine order made visible. Every act of cruelty was also an act of devotion. When a thief's hand was severed, it was not punishment, it was offering. When an adulterer's face was branded, it was not shame, it was renewal. When a heretic was burned alive, his pain was the language of repentance spoken directly to the gods. Death was not always the worst outcome. In fact, death was often considered merciful, for it ended the cycle of repayment. What the Maya truly feared was the punishment that did not end, the ones that left you alive, broken, marked forever as an example to others and as a reminder to yourself that divine justice never sleeps. In this world, the line between religion and law was dissolved. Every act of judgment was both a sentence and a ceremony. Trials were held in temple courtyards beneath towering stelae, depicting kings with serpent headdresses and gods emerging from the mouths of skulls. The condemned were often made to confess publicly, not to prove guilt but to reaffirm divine order, their words swallowed by the chants of priests and the steady beat of drums. Witnesses were not there to judge but to participate, to watch, to remember, to be cleansed by another's pain. The Maya did not punish in secret. Punishment was spectacle, and the spectacle was sacred. Even the innocent were sometimes drawn into this ritual theater. Children could be punished for the sins of their parents, families disgraced by association. To be accused was to step into a machine that could not be stopped, because the Mayan concept of justice was not about fairness, it was about balance. And balance, to them, was not moral. It was mathematical. Too much sin tilted the universe toward chaos. Too much mercy tempted the wrath of gods. So cruelty became a virtue, and suffering became a form of worship. It was a civilization that believed the world itself could collapse if the guilty went unpunished, and thus every lash, every wound, every mutilation was, in their eyes, an act of salvation. But beneath that belief lay something deeper, an unspoken fear that the gods they served were never truly satisfied. The priests spoke of divine hunger, of celestial beings that devoured light, of spirits that drank human pain as sustenance. And so, punishment evolved not only as a system of justice, but as a method of feeding the divine. Each crime became a ritual meal, each condemned soul a vessel of nourishment for powers that could not be appeased through prayer alone. It is here, in this tension between holiness and horror, that the true nature of Mayan punishment reveals itself, not as the cruelty of barbarians, but as the desperate mathematics of a people terrified of the end of the world. And yet, as we trace the lines carved into the ancient stones of their courts, we see the same human fingerprints. The fear of disorder, the hunger for control, the belief that pain can make things right. The Mayans were not monsters, they were mirrors. In their blood-soaked justice, we glimpse something disturbingly familiar, the timeless human need to make suffering sacred. But the deeper we look into this mirror, the darker it becomes. Because what awaited those judged guilty in the world of the Maya was not simply death. It was transformation into instruments of terror, each punishment crafted to echo across generations, a warning carved in bone and memory. And in that echo begins our descent into the 5 levels of horror, each one worse than death itself. To descend through the punishments of the Maya is to move downward through the architecture of fear itself. Each level was not merely a response to crime, but a deliberate ritual meant to peel away the layers of humanity until nothing remained but submission to divine order. The Maya did not design these torments to satisfy anger or vengeance. They built them as acts of cosmic maintenance, ways to ensure that the world did not slide into chaos. But for those who suffered beneath this logic, the difference between justice and cruelty ceased to exist. What follows are the 5 levels of Mayan punishment, each more horrifying, more deliberate, and more soul-consuming than the last. Each a window into a civilization that believed pain could balance the universe. The first level began not with blood, but with humiliation. For crimes that did not yet disturb the cosmic balance. Petty theft, lies, defiance, laziness. The Maya believed the body must be made a spectacle. The guilty were bound and dragged into the central plaza, their wrists tied with agave cords that bit into flesh, their faces smeared with ash and honey to invite the relentless swarm of insects that thrived in the tropical air. The heat of the day turned every sting into fire, every bite into revelation, while the crowd gathered not as witnesses of justice, but as participants in it. Children pointed and laughed, elders murmured blessings or curses, and priests observed in silence, recording each tremor of agony as if studying a sacred text. The shame was the punishment, the exposure was the ritual. The condemned might be tied naked to the posts of the temple, forced to endure the full gaze of their neighbors, their sweat and tears dripping onto the stones that had seen countless others suffer before them. Sometimes they were made to carry heavy stones on their backs or crawl through the streets while the crowd hurled maize husks or sharp pebbles. It was said that in the Mayan tongue there was no single word for humiliation, as we know it, only expressions that translated roughly to being made visible before the gods. To be shamed was to be cleansed by sight itself, to have one's spirit stripped bare in the daylight. For some, it was survivable. For others, the mockery and isolation that followed were worse than wounds. Their names became poison. Their families avoided them as if they carried contagion. The punishment was not meant to kill, only to erase the self. And yet, within the laughter of the crowd, there was always a silence waiting. A silence that hung like the moment before a storm, for everyone knew that deeper transgressions called for deeper offerings. When humiliation failed to restore balance, the flesh became the next battleground. Crimes that carried moral corruption, adultery, blasphemy, false oaths, or theft from temples, required that the body itself be marked as a warning. Mutilation was both justice and symbol, a sacred language of scars through which divine order was rewritten upon human skin. The offender might have their nose sliced away, their ears severed, their fingers crushed beneath stones, or their cheeks branded with burning obsidian rods. To the Maya, each wound was not merely punishment. It was inscription. The body became a living codex of sin, displayed for all to read. Executioners were specialists in ritualized pain, trained not only to wound, but to preserve. They painted their faces in black soot and red pigment, invoking the gods of death before beginning their work. Their hands moved with terrible precision, as if guided by invisible geometry, and when the blade of obsidian touched flesh, the cut was clean, almost artistic. The crowd did not scream, they watched. Every drop of blood was seen as a token offered to the gods, every sob a form of prayer. The victim, once mutilated, was often forced to continue living within the same community, his disfigurement serving as a living sermon about divine retribution. There are accounts in the old codices of adulterous women whose hair was cut and burned before the people, the smoke rising like a signal to the gods of fertility who had been offended. Men who lied under oath were branded on the lips, a permanent mark sealing their falsehood. Thieves who stole from the temples sometimes had their hands removed and hung from wooden poles near the shrine as warnings to all who entered. To the modern mind, such acts seem barbaric, but to the Maya, this was sacred symmetry. The hand that took must be offered back, the mouth that deceived must bear its own punishment. And yet, mutilation was not the end. It was merely the preparation, the opening of the flesh through which deeper horrors could follow. Because there were crimes, they believed, that demanded not just pain but purification through fire. The third level of punishment was reserved for transgressions that struck at the roots of cosmic and social order, betrayal, heresy, sacrilege, or defiance of a ruler. For these, the Maya turned pain into a ceremony of purification, transforming the body into a vessel through which sin might be burned away. The condemned were often bound to wooden frames or suspended above low fires of burning resin and chili, the smoke thick and suffocating, the heat searing but not yet lethal. The goal was not immediate death, it was endurance. The priests recited hymns to the gods of balance, calling upon the flames to cleanse what human law could not. The scent of burning skin mingled with incense, and the cries of the suffering rose with the smoke, believed to carry the prayers of purification upward to the heavens. Some victims were subjected to ritual piercing with thorns or stingray spines, forced to draw their own blood in offering while the crowd watched in reverent silence. Others were flayed partially alive, their skin peeled in strips while the executioners worked with almost devotional patience. Fire and blood were twin instruments of divine correction, and the priests believed that through pain, the sinner's soul could be transformed into something lighter, closer to the divine. There was method in this madness. The Maya viewed pain not as cruelty, but as communication, an exchange between human and God, body and spirit. To suffer was to speak a language the gods understood. Yet the ordeal of fire was not only for the condemned, spectators too were meant to learn from it. The smell of flesh was a warning, the sight of endurance was a lesson. The Maya taught that those who looked upon pain with indifference risked spiritual imbalance, and so the entire community participated in the ceremony through fear and awe. No one left unchanged, and though the fires were eventually extinguished, their smoke lingered for days, carrying whispers of agony through the streets, a constant reminder that the gods were watching. But even such torments had an end, and there were sins so grave, so offensive to heaven and earth alike, that no fire could cleanse them. For these, there was only one answer, the offering of life itself. When justice demanded complete restoration of cosmic balance, the Maya turned to the highest and most sacred punishment, human sacrifice. While not all sacrifices were punitive, many were voluntary offerings by warriors or chosen captives. There were crimes that condemned the guilty to become unwilling gifts to the gods. Treason, murder, blasphemy against the rulers or sacred idols. These acts tore holes in the fabric of divine order that could be mended only through blood. The condemned were purified through fasting and ritual washing, their bodies painted with blue pigment symbolizing the color of sacrifice, their hair adorned with feathers so that they might be more pleasing to the divine gaze. At dawn, the crowds would gather before the great pyramids, their eyes drawn upward to the altars where the priests waited with obsidian knives sharper than glass. The condemned was led up the long, steep steps, his breath ragged, his feet bleeding on the stone. At the summit, incense thickened the air, drums beat in perfect rhythm with the trembling of his heart, and the high priest raised his arms to the sun, chanting words older than memory. Then, with a single stroke, the knife opened the chest and lifted the still-beating heart toward the sky. The crowd erupted in reverent cries, believing that in that instant the balance was restored, that the gods had received what they were owed. The body was sometimes rolled down the steps, bouncing lifelessly as it descended toward the earth it once defied. Other forms of sacrifice were no less terrible. Some were decapitated, their heads displayed upon racks as offerings to the lords of death. Others were drowned in the sacred cenotes, their bodies sinking into the dark waters believed to be gateways to the underworld. The Maya saw these acts not as murder, but as necessity. The condemned became intermediaries between the mortal world and the divine, their suffering a message written in blood. But while death seemed to mark the final release, there was yet one more level. A punishment that went beyond the grave, one that stripped away not only life, but the very memory of existence. The fifth and final level of punishment was the most feared, for it denied even the small mercy of remembrance. To the Maya, death was not the end, it was transition. The soul, or ku, journeyed through layers of the underworld before finding peace among the ancestors, or rebirth through the cycles of nature. But there were those whose crimes were so great that they were forbidden this passage. These were the accursed, the ones sentenced to erasure. Their bodies were desecrated, their ashes scattered into refuse pits rather than sacred grounds, their names carved out of stone inscriptions, their families forbidden to speak of them again. To be erased was to die twice, once in the body and again in memory. For traitors, temple desecrators, and those who broke sacred vows, this punishment was worse than torture, for it annihilated the soul's connection to eternity. Priests would perform rites not to guide the spirit but to seal it away, condemning it to wander the void without direction or recognition. The Maya called it the death of the name, and they feared it above all things. Even families of the condemned were often made to participate in the obliteration, forced to destroy personal belongings, paintings, or carvings that bore the sinner's likeness. In a world where immortality was achieved through remembrance, through the stories carved in stone and the prayers of descendants, this was true extinction. The condemned would not exist in the songs of the future, would not walk among the stars with the ancestors. They would become unmade. And it was said that on certain nights, the wind that moved through the jungles carried the voices of these forgotten ones, souls trapped between worlds, denied even the darkness of the underworld. They were not ghosts, they were echoes, reminders that to offend the gods of the Maya was to risk more than pain or death. It was to risk erasure from existence itself. This, then, was the full descent through the 5 levels of Mayan punishment: the humiliation that broke pride, the mutilation that defaced the body, the ordeal that burned the soul, the sacrifice that fed the gods, and finally, the oblivion that devoured memory. Each stage was designed with purpose, precision, and faith in the mathematics of pain. Together, they formed a system so intricate and absolute that even in ruin, it continues to haunt the stones of their temples. For beneath the grandeur of their pyramids, beneath the beauty of their glyphs, lies a civilization that believed justice could only be achieved through suffering, and that to be truly punished was not to die, but to be forgotten by both man and God alike. In the final and most terrifying level of Mayan punishment, we step into the realm of the sacred stage, the Tzompantli, or skull rack, where flesh was not merely destroyed but turned into a declaration. Imagine the city square flooded with the coppery scent of blood and the buzz of flies, 1,000 skulls glistening like pale lanterns in the sun, each one once belonging to a life that thought itself unbreakable. Here, death was not the end. It was the beginning of spectacle, a theater of terror designed to remind every living soul of what awaited disobedience. The condemned were not granted a swift execution. They were flayed alive, their skin peeled slowly by priests wearing masks of jade and obsidian, their bodies painted in bright cinnabar red as if to mirror the rising sun that watched without pity. Their screams echoed between stone walls as conch shells blared and drums beat in rhythm with their dying hearts, the noise swelling into a symphony of horror that the gods themselves were said to feast upon. When the final breath escaped, their skulls were cleaned, polished, and mounted on the great rack, a lattice of wood and bone that grew year after year, a monument to divine vengeance and the permanence of fear. But even this was not the worst, for among the Mayans, death and punishment did not guarantee release. They believed that the condemned were bound to wander in Xibalba, the underworld, a place not of fire, but of deception, darkness, and pain beyond imagination. There, in the twisting caverns of endless night, the souls of the punished were mocked by gods with the faces of jaguars and serpents, forced to relive their agony for eternity. It was said that some priests could still hear their cries through the stones of the temples, faint wails that rose with the wind when the moon turned red. In this way, punishment extended beyond flesh. It became eternal theater, a curse that chained body and soul alike. The Mayans, in their brutal genius, found a way to make fear immortal. Each ritual, each blade stroke, was not just retribution. It was a ritual engraving upon time itself. No one who watched a punishment could sleep untroubled. The images were too vivid, too permanent, like fire burned into the brain. A civilization that could build pyramids aligned with the stars also built systems of horror aligned with the abyss. Historians often describe the Mayan justice system as balanced, rational, even ceremonial, but beneath that veneer of structure lay something more sinister, the understanding that terror itself was governance. The punishments were not born of cruelty for its own sake, but of an idea that through suffering, the world stayed in order. Every drop of blood spilled on those temple stones was an offering to balance, a payment to the gods for the continued existence of life itself. The rulers understood the psychology of fear better than most modern empires ever would. They didn't just punish the body, they rewired the collective mind of a people. When a thief was caught and publicly sacrificed, it was not only his fate that mattered, it was the message: defy the order, and the gods themselves will peel you open. The ordinary citizens, watching from the edges of the square, felt their resolve collapse. No rebellion could grow in soil watered by such terror. There are ancient murals where you can still see the depictions of these punishments, painted in deep ochre and faded turquoise, showing prisoners bound and flayed, hearts lifted skyward, skulls lined neatly like a ghastly harvest. Archaeologists call them ritual scenes, but to the eye that lingers, they are portraits of annihilation, a visual script of how pain was transformed into order. These murals were placed in public places, not hidden away, because fear had to be seen to be believed. Some cities even scheduled their punishments during festivals, ensuring that the entire population, men, women, and children, would witness the execution as part of their spiritual education. To be Mayan was to live in a world where divine justice looked like dismemberment, and where silence in the face of horror was survival. But what chills the blood most is not the physical brutality, but the perfection of its system. There was a logic behind every scream. The Mayans believed that pain released energy, that the suffering of the guilty was a kind of purification necessary for cosmic harmony. To them, punishment wasn't cruelty, it was maintenance. The gods demanded it, the crops required it, the balance depended on it. It was a sacred economy of agony. Imagine living in a world where the torment of others was not questioned, but celebrated, where the priest who flayed the condemned was seen not as a butcher, but as a guardian of reality itself. That is the core of the Mayan nightmare, its seamless merging of devotion and destruction, of faith and fear. The darkest revelation, however, lies in the quiet aftermath. When the drums stopped and the priests departed, the skull racks remained. The wind whistled through hollow eye sockets. Children walking past would not flinch. They would point, name the skulls, and whisper their stories. Fear had become heritage. Over time, the skulls turned brittle, the wood decayed, but the idea endured, that power is kept through spectacle and obedience through terror. Some historians argue that this obsession with ritualized pain was part of what doomed the civilization, that they spent too much blood trying to feed gods that were never real. But in a chilling way, the system worked. For centuries, order was maintained. The people obeyed, the rulers reigned, and the gods, imagined or not, were satisfied. Even today, when archaeologists uncover a tomb Antli, they speak of it with a strange mix of awe and dread. Beneath the dirt, the skulls still grin, jawbones frozen in the last moment of horror, as if mocking the living, forever believing they were safe from the hunger of gods. Every discovery is a whisper from the past, a reminder that civilization and savagery often share the same foundations. The Mayan world was not a nightmare of chaos. It was a nightmare of order, where horror was calculated, polished, and sanctified. And that is what made it worse than death itself. When the sun finally sets over the ruins of Chichen Itza or Copan, when the stone temples blush with the last light of day and the jungle exhales its breath of damp earth and decay, it is difficult to imagine the screams that once rose from these same steps. The silence now feels almost merciful, but it is a silence that remembers. Every slab of limestone, every faded carving carries a residue of the terror that kept this civilization alive. What we call ruins were once theaters of judgment, and the air that now hums with cicadas once vibrated with the cries of the condemned. Standing among these stones, it becomes clear that the Mayans did not build monuments only to worship their gods. They built monuments to fear, to the human capacity to believe that cruelty could preserve order. That belief, more than the blades or the fires, was the true instrument of their control. It is what allowed a society of extraordinary architects, astronomers, and poets to also be engineers of ritualized agony, turning faith into machinery and pain into power. The farther we move from that time, the easier it is to tell ourselves that we have evolved beyond such darkness, that these acts were the relics of a superstitious age when people bled for gods who never spoke. Yet the echoes are not gone. They have only changed shape. The same logic that justified those punishments, that terror maintains obedience, that spectacle ensures silence, has never truly vanished from human civilization. We still live among systems that sanctify suffering, though now we disguise them behind laws, screens, and ideologies. The Mayan priests burned incense as they tore out hearts. We burn reputations, nations, and lives in quieter, more sophisticated rituals of dominance. History does not repeat itself. It refines itself, hides its teeth behind civilization's smile. The Mayans built their order upon altars of bone, and we build ours upon invisible scaffolds of fear. The difference is only in what we dare to call progress. Yet even within the horror, there was a strange, haunting beauty to their conviction. A belief that the universe demanded balance, that every sin and every crime sent ripples into the cosmos, which could only be stilled by blood. In their eyes, they were not monsters. They were custodians of equilibrium, priests of necessity. And perhaps that is what makes their legacy so unsettling. It reminds us that the line between righteousness and brutality is as thin as a blade's edge, and that once a culture begins to sanctify pain, it rarely stops until the gods themselves are silent. The Mayans fell, their temples swallowed by vines, their rituals buried under centuries of earth. But the philosophy that birthed their punishments, the worship of control through fear, still breathes in the modern world, dressed in new names, fluent in new tongues. So as you look at those empty temples and eroded skull racks, ask yourself, what truly makes something worse than death? Is it the pain of the body or the submission of the soul? The Mayans answered that question with blood, with spectacle, and with silence that stretched for centuries. And now we carry their echoes, whispering through time, a reminder that civilization is never as far from barbarism as it believes. If this descent into the shadows of the Mayan world has shaken something inside you, if these stories make you question what humanity is capable of, then subscribe to uncover more of history's forbidden corners, where truth is darker than myth, and the past refuses to stay buried. Tell me in the comments which of these punishments haunts you the most, and could you have survived a world where mercy was a sin?